You think black mothers in the 1960s struggled to put food on the table? Think again. With barely $1 and pure kitchen genius, they transformed the cheapest ingredients into meals that felt like celebrations. Here are 60 cheap 1960s recipes black mothers turned into feasts. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Sweet potato biscuits were a creative way of stretching precious wheat flour while using what gardens could provide in abundance. Sweet potatoes, easy to grow and store, became the secret ingredient that gave biscuits sweetness, color, and body. Mothers mashed them into dough, adding just enough flour and fat to create something tender and warm. These biscuits filled kitchens with comfort and provided fuel for long days of work. They were served at breakfast with sorghum syrup or eaten at supper alongside beans or greens. For many families, they became an affordable luxury, a way to bring a little sweetness to the table without relying on expensive sugar. Children loved them for their soft texture and unique flavor, and adults valued how far they could stretch ingredients. Sweet potato biscuits were more than clever cooking. They represented a balance of necessity and creativity, proof that even in the toughest times, resourcefulness could create moments of joy. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the civil rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small, crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklings carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin' cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Kopi stew was a hearty, protein-rich dish that could feed a family on little more than field peas, onions, and a bit of cured pork. Simmered low and slow, the cowpeas absorbed the smoky, savory flavors of ham hock or salt pork, creating a rich broth. This was a common dish in African American homes, particularly in the South, where cowpeas were easy to grow and store. The stew was ladled over rice or eaten with cornbread, making it both filling and affordable. Cowpea stew often appeared in late summer and fall when harvests were abundant, and it was a way to stretch fresh produce into satisfying meals. The taste was earthy, the texture creamy, and it carried the comfort of something made to nourish in every sense of the word. Though it remains known in some circles, for many it has faded into memory, overshadowed by other bean and pea recipes. Yet it still stands as a testament to the art of making humble ingredients into something worth remembering. Hogshead hash was a breakfast that spoke to the no-waste mentality of African American cooking traditions that valued resourcefulness and respect for food. When a hog was butchered, nothing was left unused, and the head provided meat that could be stewed, chopped, seasoned, and fried into hearty dishes. Families would mix the shredded meat with potatoes, onions, and sometimes peppers, then cook it together in a skillet until browned, crispy, and richly flavored. The flavor was intense, smoky, and savory, and it filled the house with a smell that lingered long after breakfast was finished. It was not just food, but a reminder of how creativity and resourcefulness made survival possible in communities where every scrap mattered. Children grew up eating it without complaint because it was hearty, flavorful, and kept them full through school, farm work, or chores. Adults relied on it as a way to honor the animal by using every part of it, ensuring nothing went to waste. Though hog's head hash has nearly vanished from today's kitchens, it once stood as a powerful symbol of resilience, thrift, and respect for tradition that sustained families. Molasses cornmeal. Porridge was a breakfast built on necessity, made from the simplest staples and sweetened with molasses when sugar was too costly. Cornmeal boiled into a thick porridge formed the base, hearty enough to fuel long days of work. The addition of molasses added both flavor and energy, turning an otherwise plain bowl into something more comforting. Mothers prepared it for children before school, and families ate it together on cold mornings when other options were scarce. It filled stomachs quickly and used ingredients that were always on hand in rural households. Molasses was cheaper than refined sugar, making it a go-to for sweetening. The porridge could be eaten plain or with a splash of milk if available, creating small luxuries out of simple ingredients. Though modest, it carried warmth and stability during uncertain times. Molasses cornmeal porridge was proof that even in the toughest years, resourcefulness and care could turn basics into sustaining comfort. Cornmeal dumplings in milk were a dish that blended simplicity with comfort, making them a favorite in many households when mornings were cold and food was scarce. Dumplings were mixed from cornmeal and flour, shaped into small rounds, and simmered in sweetened milk until soft and tender. The result was both filling and slightly sweet, a dish that could serve as either breakfast or dessert depending on how it was prepared. For families with children, it was often given in the morning to ensure they had energy for school. Adults relied on it as well, especially when more costly staples like bacon or sausage were unavailable. Cornmeal dumplings in milk carried a sense of warmth and security, proof that even the humblest ingredients could create satisfaction. It was a dish remembered not only for its flavor, but for the way it stretched supplies in hard times. It became part of the rhythm of survival, tying family memories to the shared strength of the table. collard green Potlikker soup captured the very essence of slow cooking and careful stewardship. After hours of simmering collard greens with smoked meat, the broth left in the pot was a mineral-rich elixir, treasured as much as the greens themselves. Families poured this flavorful liquid into bowls and sipped it with pieces of cornbread, believing it to restore strength and spirit after long days of work. Some added hot pepper vinegar for a lively kick, while others preferred it plain and soothing. Children learned early never to throw away the Potlikker, understanding that its nutrients were too valuable to waste. Neighbors often shared jars with the sick or elderly, turning the simple broth into a gesture of care and healing. Modern kitchens may overlook this tradition, discarding the liquid without thought, but for those who remember, the taste of Potlikker carries the memory of community generosity and the wisdom of using every drop the garden and the kitchen could provide. Homemade cornmeal pancakes for supper were another way families stretched basic ingredients into a filling meal. Flour, cornmeal, lard, and milk came together in a batter that fried into golden cakes on a hot skillet. My grandmother served them stacked, drizzled with syrup if any was available, or eaten plain with butter when syrup was gone. The pancakes were fluffy yet hearty, giving enough energy to hold a family until morning. They cost next to nothing but fed many, which was exactly what mattered most. Children loved the sweetness when syrup was added, while adults appreciated the sheer substance of the cakes. In the 1960s, cornmeal pancakes were a staple when meat was scarce, turning humble ingredients into something warm and reliable. It was comfort food born of necessity, one of those meals that never left memory even as times changed. Homemade cornmeal pancakes carried the spirit of thrift, filling plates with love and survival. Baked raccoon with sweet potatoes was a hearty, deeply flavorful dish that reflected the ingenuity of rural African-American hunting communities. When store-bought meat was scarce or too costly, raccoon provided a source of fresh protein for those who knew how to prepare it properly. The raccoon meat was carefully cleaned, soaked to remove any strong flavors, and then seasoned with herbs, onions, and spices before being baked low and slow. Sweet potatoes, sliced thick and arranged around the meat, soaked up the savory juices as they roasted, creating a sweet and salty pairing that filled the house with an irresistible aroma. This dish was not only about nourishment, it was about community and the skill of turning what the land provided into a meal worth gathering for. Often prepared during the cooler months after a successful hunt, it brought people together around the table to share stories and warmth. While today most people have never tasted raccoon, those who grew up with it remember its richness, the tender texture, and the way the sweet potatoes balanced its earthiness. It was more than just dinner. It was a reminder of self-sufficiency and resourceful cooking passed down through generations. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Stewed cowpeas were a dish that carried clear echoes of West African foodways, keeping cultural traditions alive while also providing affordable nourishment. Cowpeas, grown widely in fields, were simmered slowly with simple seasonings like onions, garlic, or salt pork if available. The peas developed a creamy texture as they cooked, creating a dish that was both filling and flavorful. For families, it was a way of stretching harvests into meals that could last for days. Cowpeas were affordable, durable, and reliable, making them a lifeline for many households during hard times. The stew paired perfectly with cornbread or rice, turning simple ingredients into something complete and comforting. Beyond nourishment, it carried heritage, tying families to ancestral practices of making the most of legumes. Stewed cowpeas embodied resilience and resourcefulness, showing how traditions endured even in adversity. For many, it was more than food. It was history simmering on the stove. Stewed oxtails with rice gravy brought deep flavor and slow-cooked richness to Sunday tables across many African American communities. Oxtails, once inexpensive and overlooked, were browned in heavy pots and then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until the meat turned buttery soft. The braising liquid thickened into a silky gravy that clung to each grain of rice, creating a dish that was equal parts comfort and celebration. Families saved this meal for weekends when everyone could gather because patience was essential and conversation flowed while the pot worked its magic. Children sneaked tastes from wooden spoons, drawn by the savory aroma that filled the house from morning until evening. The humble tale, once discarded by butchers, became a centerpiece of pride and ingenuity. Today, rising prices and faster cooking habits mean fewer people take the time to coax such tenderness from a simple cut of beef, but those who remember the meal speak of it as a perfect union of thrift, skill, and the slow rhythm of family life. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Pokeweed greens were a survival food that required knowledge and care. The young leaves of the pokeweed plant were foraged in spring, boiled in several changes of water to remove toxins, and then cooked with seasoning, often alongside salt pork or ham hocks. In African American communities with strong rural roots, foraging was both a necessity and a skill passed down through generations. Pokeweed had a unique flavor, somewhere between spinach and asparagus, but it could only be eaten safely when prepared correctly. These greens were served alongside cornbread, sometimes with a dash of vinegar for brightness. For many, they were a reminder of hard times, but also of the resourcefulness that kept families fed. Gathering pokeweed was a seasonal ritual, one that connected people to the land and to each other. While it is rarely eaten today due to the labor and caution required, its memory lingers as part of the legacy of making the most of what nature offered. Fried catfish and cornbread was a breakfast plate that reflected the abundance of rivers and the skill of African American cooks in the South. Catfish could be caught at little cost, cleaned, coated in cornmeal, and fried crisp in cast-iron skillets. Paired with hot cornbread fresh from the oven, the meal was both hearty and nourishing. It gave workers the energy needed for long days in the fields, and children the strength to get through school without hunger. Families often made it on weekends when fishing provided enough to share with neighbors, turning it into a communal meal. The taste was bold and rustic, with a combination of crunchy fish and soft bread that defined comfort. Though fish is not often associated with breakfast today, fried catfish and cornbread once stood proudly on morning tables. It remains a reflection of resilience and resourcefulness, showing how nature and tradition came together to sustain communities. Crackling cornbread was a dish born from thrift, turning leftover pork skins into something rich and memorable. Cornmeal, water, and a little fat created the base, while the addition of crunchy cracklings gave each bite texture and flavor that plain cornbread could not match. It was a clever way to use every part of the pig, ensuring nothing went to waste during hard times. Families often baked it in cast-iron skillets, where the edges crisped up and the center stayed tender. Served alongside greens, beans, or stews, it became both a side and a treat in its own right. Crackling cornbread carried the smoky taste of pork and the heartiness of cornmeal, making it perfect for filling stomachs and lifting spirits. Children especially loved the crispy bits hidden inside. It was food that showed how resourcefulness could turn scraps into something treasured. Crackling cornbread remains a cultural symbol of resilience, proof that even humble ingredients could create comfort. Pickled pig feet with bread were a dish that reflected both thrift and flavor, often served cold in rural communities as a morning meal. Pig feet, simmered and preserved in vinegar brine with spices, became a protein source that lasted far longer than fresh meat. Eaten with slices of bread, it was salty, tangy, and surprisingly filling. Families turned to it because it was cheap and practical, ensuring no part of the animal ever went to waste. The flavor carried a boldness that lingered, and though not every child enjoyed it, many adults looked back on it with fondness as a food of survival. In households where resources were scarce, a plate of pickled pig feet with bread could be enough to start the day. It was more than just sustenance. It was a dish that represented resilience and the ability to create meals from overlooked cuts. Pickled pig feet with bread carried strength, memory, and the taste of endurance in difficult times. Skillet. Fried catfish with cornmeal crust was the pride of riverbank communities and churchyard gatherings. Fishermen returned at dawn with fresh-caught catfish while cooks prepared heavy iron skillets filled with hot lard or peanut oil. Fillets were dredged in seasoned cornmeal until every piece was coated in a golden layer ready for the crackling pan. The sizzle of fish hitting the oil was music to children waiting for the first crisp bite. Friday fish fries became weekly celebrations where neighbors brought sides of slaw and hush puppies, and stories flowed as freely as sweet tea. The flavor of smoky river water lingered in each flaky bite, reminding everyone of the connection between food and place. Modern diners may order catfish in restaurants, but the ritual of catching, cleaning, and frying by the water's edge has faded, leaving only memories of warm evenings when the entire town smelled of cornmeal and spice and laughter carried across the banks. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Fatback fried cabbage was a simple, deeply satisfying dish that turned a humble head of cabbage into a flavorful side worth remembering. Fatback, a cured slab of pork fat with a rich, salty taste, was diced and fried until it released its golden drippings. Into this savory base went shredded cabbage, sizzling as it hit the hot pan and slowly softening while soaking up all the flavor. The edges browned slightly, giving a hint of caramelization, while the tender leaves carried the smoky richness of the pork. This was a dish that needed no complicated seasoning, just salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. In African American kitchens, especially in the rural South, fatback fried cabbage was an easy way to feed a family, served alongside cornbread and beans or as part of a larger spread. It represented the practice of using every part of what was available, from the vegetables in the garden to the trimmings from a butchered hog. Today, while cabbage is still common, the tradition of frying it in fatback has faded, replaced by lighter cooking methods, but its flavor remains unforgettable to those who grew up eating it. Neckbone stew was a pot of patience and love. Black mothers knew how to take the cheapest cut of meat and turn it into something that could feed everyone. Neck bones were bony, fatty, and far from tender. But slow cooking changed everything. They'd brown them in a heavy pot with onions and garlic, letting the aroma fill the kitchen long before supper was ready. Then came potatoes, carrots, and a sprinkle of whatever spices were on hand, often just salt, pepper, and a hint of bay. The broth thickened slowly, rich with collagen and depth, until every bone gave up its flavor. The meat clung to the bone, tender and silky, floating in a sauce that seemed to hug each vegetable. Children would watch the pot simmer, knowing that when it was done, there'd be enough to go around. In homes where every dollar mattered, this dish proved that care could make abundance out of scarcity. It wasn't fancy, but it was real food, filling, warm, and made to last. Every bowl carried the memory of the cook's hands and the sound of laughter echoing from the table. Rabbit stew was a survival dish that leaned heavily on resourcefulness, relying on wild-caught game to provide protein when store-bought meat was out of reach. Families living near fields or wooded areas often turned to hunting small game like rabbit to keep meals going. The meat, though lean, became tender and flavorful when simmered low and slow with vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, or onions. It was a dish that required patience, but rewarded it with a rich broth and enough food to feed many mouths. For children, it was often their introduction to the reality that dinner did not always come from a store. Rabbit stew represented a connection to the land, as well as the necessity of making use of every available resource. It was not a luxury meal, but a practical one, carrying pride for those who could provide for their families with skill and effort. Rabbit stew was proof that survival often depended on ingenuity and determination. Onion and potato hash cakes were one of those breakfasts that always felt hearty, even without meat. Potatoes and onions were grated, mixed with flour or cornmeal, and fried into crisp patties that could be eaten plain or with hot sauce if available. The dish was cheap, easy to prepare, and could stretch across several plates, making it ideal for large households. It was often made in the early mornings before children headed to school or adults to long shifts at work. The taste was simple but filling, a combination of flavors that became closely tied to daily life in tough years. Families leaned on it not only for its thrift, but for the comfort it gave in the face of uncertainty. Onion and potato hash cakes fueled countless mornings of determination, carrying people through struggles outside the kitchen. They became a dish remembered not just for their flavor, but for their role in sustaining courage and community. Wild muscadine grape jam brought the late summer woods to the breakfast table in a deep purple shine. Children and parents walked along fence lines and wooded edges with baskets in hand, searching for the thick-skinned grapes that thrived in southern heat. Once gathered, the fruit was boiled gently until the skins burst and the pulp softened, filling kitchens with a fragrance that hinted at honey and earth. The juice was strained and mixed with sugar, then cooked again until it thickened into a jam rich enough to spread over biscuits or stir into morning porridge. Families prized each jar, knowing that muscadines grew wild and free, needing only careful hands and patience to become something sweet. In some towns, church groups organized picking days, turning the harvest into a social event where songs and laughter echoed through the vines. Today, supermarket grapes have replaced the wild hunt, and store-bought jams lack the musky depth of fruit ripened under southern sun. But memories of purple-stained fingers still linger in many hearts. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful. Collard greens with potlikker was a dish where nothing went to waste and flavor reigned supreme. Collard greens were simmered for hours with smoked pork or turkey, allowing their sturdy leaves to soften and absorb the rich, savory essence of the meat. The resulting broth, known as potlikker, was a nutrient-packed liquid treasured as much as the greens themselves. Served with cornbread for dipping, it was both meal and sustenance, especially in lean times. In African-American cooking, this was more than just a side. It was a way to nourish the body fully, drawing on traditions of resourcefulness passed down through generations. Potlikker was even believed to have restorative qualities, making it a home remedy as well as a culinary staple. The flavor was deep, smoky, and satisfying, with the greens offering a balance of bitterness and earthiness. While collard greens remain a symbol of Southern cooking, the reverence for potlikker has faded, leaving behind a tradition worth remembering for its taste and history alike. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that breakfast didn't need money to taste good. It began with leftover grits or cornmeal porridge, cooled overnight until firm. The next morning, it was sliced thick and fried in a bit of grease until each piece turned golden and crisp on the outside, soft and creamy inside. Mothers served it with syrup, molasses, or gravy depending on what the day called for. The crackle of cornmeal in the pan was the sound of thrift at work, using what was left to make something new again. It filled bellies before long walks to school or shifts at work, giving warmth that stuck through the morning. Fried cornmeal mush wasn't just a dish. It was a rhythm, a morning ritual built from yesterday's effort. It made sure nothing went to waste, and everyone started the day with something to smile about. Sweet, savory, or somewhere in between, it was a small joy that cost almost nothing but meant everything. Braised oxtails with gravy were another example of resourceful cooking, turning tough, inexpensive cuts into rich and comforting meals. Oxtails, once considered scraps, were simmered for hours until the meat fell tender from the bone and the broth thickened into gravy. Families stretched the dish by serving it over rice or potatoes, ensuring every drop went further. Though it required patience, the end result was hearty, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. It became a Sunday dinner favorite in many households, reserved for when families wanted something special without spending much. The dish reflected a culture that knew how to turn difficulty into flavor, coaxing the best out of what was available. Children often fought over the bones, savoring every last bit of meat and gravy. Braised oxtails with gravy may have started as a humble survival recipe, but it grew into a treasured comfort meal that carried pride, tradition, and the spirit of making the most of little. Rye coffee substitute with toast was born out of scarcity, but it carried warmth into countless mornings. Coffee beans were expensive and often hard to find, so roasted rye grains were brewed instead, producing a hot, bitter drink that resembled coffee. Families paired it with toast made from whatever bread was available, sometimes stale but still sustaining. The ritual of drinking a hot beverage in the morning mattered as much as the food itself, offering comfort before facing long days of uncertainty. Adults leaned on this substitute to keep their routines intact, finding strength in familiarity even without the real thing. Toast added bulk, and sometimes apple butter or syrup was spread on top if there was any to spare. Rye coffee substitute with toast reflected the creativity of families who refused to give up small comforts despite financial strain. It carried both warmth and resolve, fueling people with more than calories. It gave them routine and stability. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Okra and tomato stew was a garden-born staple that thrived in warm southern summers when vegetables were plentiful. Fresh okra pods, picked before they grew tough, were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and bell peppers until the flavors melded into a thick, savory stew. The okra's natural thickening quality gave the dish a comforting, almost silky texture, while the tomatoes added tang and brightness. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of smoked meat for depth, this was a dish that could stand alone with cornbread or be served alongside fish or chicken. In African American kitchens, it was a way to make the most of backyard gardens and stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal. It could be made entirely vegetarian or enriched with bits of bacon or ham hock, depending on what was available. The beauty of okra and tomato stew lay in its adaptability. Each household had its own variation, often influenced by what was growing just outside the kitchen door. Though it remains known in some southern homes, its presence has faded as fresh garden cooking has become less common in everyday life. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Pig's feet. Stew was the definition of making do with what others threw away, transforming discarded cuts into rich, savory meals. Pig's feet, cheap and often overlooked, were simmered for hours until the meat turned tender and the broth deep with flavor. Families paired it with vegetables like onions, carrots, or potatoes if they had them, stretching the stew further. The collagen from the feet created a thick, silky broth that felt more luxurious than the ingredients suggested. In many communities, this dish became a quiet source of pride, proving that nothing needed to be wasted. It reflected a deep cultural knowledge of how to coax nourishment from humble parts of the animal, keeping bellies full when options were few. Often served with cornbread, it was hearty enough to carry families through cold evenings and lean times. Pig's feet. Stew may not have looked glamorous, but it told a story of resilience and survival that carried across generations. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Turnip greens with cornmeal dumplings turned garden scraps and pantry staples into a dish that could sustain whole families. Turnip greens, often overlooked in favor of the root, were simmered into a flavorful broth that made the most of what was available. Cornmeal dumplings, cheap and filling, floated on top, soaking in the savory liquid until soft and satisfying. Together, they created a meal that cost almost nothing yet delivered both nutrition and comfort. This dish was especially common in rural households where gardens provided greens, but money for meat was scarce. The dumplings acted as the backbone, stretching the pot into something that could serve many mouths. Families passed recipes down, adding small touches like onions or peppers when they had the means. For many, it was a taste of both survival and heritage, reminding them of how ingenuity kept households fed. Turnip greens with cornmeal dumplings became more than just food. It was resilience served in a steaming bowl. Homemade chow chow relish added brightness and crunch to plates crowded with greens, beans, and smoked meats. Cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes were chopped fine and simmered with vinegar, mustard seed, and sugar until they formed a tangy condiment that could last through winter. Every household had a slightly different recipe, some sweeter, some hotter, each a reflection of the cook's own hand. The relish brought sharp contrast to rich dishes like pork shoulder or pinto beans, cutting through heaviness with a lively bite. In late summer, neighbors gathered to chop vegetables together, sharing stories as big pots bubbled on outdoor fires. Jars lined pantry shelves in rows of glowing gold and green, a promise of flavor when fresh produce was long gone. Over time, store-bought pickles and bottled sauces replaced the careful preparation of chow chow, but its memory endures wherever families recall the sound of knives on wooden boards and the reward of a bright spoonful alongside a hearty meal. Fried bream with hush puppies was a meal born from rivers, ponds, and hands that knew how to fish. Bream, small and plentiful, cost little more than the time spent catching them. My grandmother cleaned the fish, rolled them in cornmeal, and fried them crisp in hot oil until the skin crackled golden brown. Hush puppies bubbled alongside, little cornmeal fritters that were cheap to mix and cooked quickly. Together, they made a dinner that felt rich without draining a wallet. Families gathered around plates piled high, dipping hush puppies into hot sauce or eating them plain while the fish cooled. The taste was pure Southern tradition, simple, salty, and tied to the land and water. In the 1960s, when grocery stores were expensive, fishing poles and cast nets provided meals for families who had little to spare. Fried bream with hush puppies was more than food. It was a reminder of resourcefulness and community, where the catch of the day fed everyone at the table. Sorrel drink was a vibrant, ruby-red beverage that carried both Caribbean heritage and Southern holiday tradition. Made from dried hibiscus petals steeped in boiling water, it had a tart, cranberry-like flavor that was softened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. For many African-American families with Caribbean roots, sorrel was a Christmas season essential, served chilled in tall glasses during festive gatherings. The deep color and fragrant aroma made it as beautiful as it was refreshing. Some recipes added citrus peel for brightness, or even a splash of rum for the adults, creating a drink that could be both celebratory and comforting. Making sorrel was often a family affair, with large batches prepared in advance so the flavors could deepen overnight. While its roots stretch back to West Africa and the Caribbean, sorrel drink became part of African American holiday tables in regions where migration brought culinary traditions together. Today, it is still beloved in some households, but remains largely unknown to those outside the culture, quietly holding its place as a seasonal treasure tied to history, family, and celebration. Red gravy with rice was a breakfast dish that combined economy with comfort in African American households. The gravy was made from tomatoes, onions, and seasoning, simmered until thick and poured over steaming rice. It was filling, affordable, and deeply satisfying, providing warmth and energy to carry through the day. For many families, rice was cheaper than bread and could be stretched to feed everyone, while tomatoes added both flavor and color. The dish was common across the South, where it became a daily staple for working people who needed hearty food before long hours of labor. Children often grew up with it as a familiar morning ritual, while adults valued its reliability and ease of preparation. Red gravy with rice was never fancy, but it symbolized resilience and the ability to make simple ingredients carry meaning. Though rarely served in breakfast form today, it was once a proud and practical tradition. Pinto bean chili was the kind of dish that took the humblest pantry ingredients and turned them into something filling enough to carry a family through the week. Pinto beans were cheap, hearty, and easy to store, making them perfect for lean years when meat was scarce. Families would simmer them slowly with onions, peppers, and spices, and if they were fortunate enough to have a little ground beef or scraps of pork, they would stir those in too. The result was a thick, smoky stew that stretched flavor and sustenance far beyond what the ingredients suggested. Every bite carried warmth, and the spices masked the lack of meat so no one felt deprived. Pinto bean chili became a staple at kitchen tables, not just because it was affordable, but because it was adaptable, able to be eaten with rice, cornbread, or on its own. It kept families fed, bellies warm, and spirits lifted in times when resources were few and creativity was essential for survival. Leftover pie for breakfast was a common occurrence in large households where nothing was wasted. Sweet potato pie, chess pie, or fruit pies baked the night before were often sliced and eaten cold in the morning with coffee or milk. For children, it was an exciting way to begin the day, while adults saw it as practical and filling. It reflected the rhythm of large families, where every meal had to stretch, and desserts could not be reserved only for evenings. Leftover pie carried both joy and necessity, showing how households turned indulgence into sustenance. The flavors of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sweet roots lingered, making mornings brighter even when other meals were sparse. Eating pie for breakfast symbolized both frugality and comfort, a way of preserving energy and spirit in difficult times. Leftover pie for breakfast became a fond memory for many, a dish that reflected resilience and the creativity of stretching food in every way possible. Mustard greens with smoked turkey necks carried the flavor of endurance from one generation to the next. During the Great Depression and later years when ham hocks became expensive or scarce, cooks turned to the neck bones of smoked turkey for the same rich depth. The greens simmered slowly in seasoned broth until tender, soaking up the smoky essence of the meat and the spice of crushed red pepper. Families gathered around the pot to breathe in the savory aroma while cornbread baked in the oven. This dish offered nourishment and warmth, proof that ingenuity could turn modest ingredients into a feast. Children learned to wash and tear the greens while elders seasoned by taste alone, passing down a craft more than a recipe. Today, pre-washed greens and quick cooking methods have dulled the ritual, but the memory of long simmering pots and the steady comfort of smoked turkey necks remains a powerful reminder of resilience and shared meals. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Chitlins with vinegar peppers were more than a dish. They were an event. Preparing pig intestines required hours of cleaning and cooking, often becoming a group effort among family members. Once ready, the chitlins were simmered slowly with onions, garlic, and spices until tender, their earthy flavor deepened by the cooking process. To serve, they were topped with tangy vinegar-soaked peppers, cutting through the richness and adding a bright kick. This dish was especially popular in winter months, often tied to holiday celebrations or community gatherings where large pots fed many people. The smell of chitlins cooking was unmistakable, and while some loved it and others turned away, no one could deny its cultural significance. It was a connection to a history of making use of every part of the animal, and to the resilience of cooks who worked with what they had. Today, chitlins with vinegar peppers are rare outside of certain communities, but the tradition lives on in the memories and taste buds of those who grew up with them. Pinto beans and cornbread was a meal that carried generations. Pinto beans simmered for hours with salt pork or a leftover ham bone until the broth grew thick and smoky. The cornbread baked in cast iron, crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, waiting to soak up every drop. This was more than food. It was a way of surviving with dignity. For many families, a pot of beans could last 2 or 3 days, with each reheating somehow tasting even better. Black mothers made sure the pot never ran dry, stirring as they talked, prayed, or planned the week ahead. Beans filled the home with a smell of comfort and quiet pride. It was protein, flavor, and history, all built from a few cents worth of ingredients. Eating together, they'd crumble cornbread into their bowls, letting it soak until it became a stew of sorts, warm, familiar, sustaining. In that simple mix of beans and bread lived proof that home cooking could be both humble and holy. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup-making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Boiled hog maw may not sound appealing to modern ears, but in the 1950s it was a testament to using every possible part of the pig. Hog maw, the pig's stomach, was cleaned thoroughly and simmered until tender, often with onions, peppers, and potatoes. It stretched the animal further, making sure nothing was wasted when money was scarce. Though the texture was unusual, the flavor was savory, especially when seasoned well. Families that relied on thrift-prized hog maw for its affordability and ability to feed many mouths. It was often served with cornbread or rice, making the meal both practical and filling. The dish carried cultural roots as well, passed down in communities that valued resourcefulness and tradition. Molasses cornmeal custard was a dish that offered sweetness and substance while depending only on pantry staples. Families baked it by whisking cornmeal, milk, eggs when available, and molasses into a smooth mixture that thickened into a soft pudding in the oven. It was inexpensive to prepare, but filling enough to feed a household, making it a beloved breakfast or after-supper treat. The flavor was earthy and rich, with the deep sweetness of molasses carrying through each bite. Children often looked forward to it as a rare indulgence in households where desserts were not common. Adults valued it for its practicality, since it used cheap ingredients that could stretch for days. Molasses cornmeal custard represented thrift, but it also carried warmth and a sense of care, showing how families turned necessities into moments of comfort. It became part of the memory of kitchens during times of struggle, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. Sorrel hibiscus tea brought a ruby glow to church socials and summer porch gatherings. Its tart floral flavor, steeped from dried hibiscus petals and sweetened with cane sugar, reflected Caribbean influences that African American families carried north and west during migrations. Grandmothers brewed the tea in large enamel pots, sometimes adding a hint of ginger or a squeeze of lime to brighten the taste. Children watched the deep red liquid swirl into pitchers, knowing it signaled a special occasion. Served chilled over cracked ice in simple glasses, sorrel tea cooled guests during humid evenings while hymns and laughter filled the air. The drink offered more than refreshment. It was a quiet connection to ancestors and homelands across the sea. Over time, soda and store-bought beverages replaced the careful steeping of petals and spices, and the vibrant tradition faded in many communities. Those who still make it treasure the deep crimson reminder of resilience and shared history that once colored every celebration. Collard green omelet was a breakfast born from thrift and the habit of making yesterday's leftovers stretch. Collard greens, usually cooked long and slow with seasoning, were often tucked into eggs the next morning, creating a dish that was both frugal and flavorful. Families valued it because it made use of what they already had, ensuring nothing went to waste. The combination of tender greens with fluffy eggs gave a balance of nutrition and satisfaction. For children, it was a familiar flavor carried into a new form, while adults enjoyed the heartiness without requiring more expensive meat. It was a dish that tied breakfast to dinner, blending the rhythms of the household kitchen into one continuous cycle of reuse. Betty Crocker kitchens may have praised convenience, but African American homes thrived on this kind of ingenuity. Collard green omelets are rare today, but they once carried the quiet wisdom of making much from little and starting mornings strong. Black-eyed pea soup was a staple of lean nights, a protein-packed dish that provided comfort and sustenance when little else was available. Black-eyed peas, affordable and widely grown, simmered into a hearty soup that warmed families from the inside out. The dish was often flavored with onions, garlic, or scraps of cured meat, though it was nourishing even when cooked plain. Served with cornbread or rice, it created a meal that was simple, filling, and reliable. For many, it also carried symbolic meaning, tied to traditions of luck and prosperity. During the 1950s, however, it was primarily survival food, proof of how communities could thrive on legumes that kept costs low. Children grew up on the earthy taste of the soup, and families relied on it to stretch thin pantries. Black-eyed pea soup was both medicine and meal, a dish that blended culture and necessity while keeping countless families strong through hard times. Scalded cornmeal porridge was one of the simplest breakfasts, but it was dependable and nourishing in every season. Cornmeal was whisked into boiling water, then enriched with a splash of milk if available, turning into a smooth, hot cereal. It was plain but filling, eaten with a little molasses, sugar, or even just salt depending on what a family had. Children grew up with bowls of it before heading to school, and adults leaned on it for early morning labor. The dish carried an earthy flavor that became familiar, tied to the smell of steaming pots in family kitchens. It was cheap to prepare and stretched far, making it a perfect meal during lean years. Scalded cornmeal porridge was proof that even the most basic ingredients could sustain life when nothing else was available. It became one of those dishes remembered with both fondness and respect, a reminder of perseverance and the strength found in simple foods. Sweet potato pie with brown sugar meringue crowned holiday tables with a beauty that matched its flavor. Smooth, mashed sweet potatoes blended with warm spices created a filling as rich as any custard, poured into a flaky handmade crust. The crowning touch was a cloud of meringue whipped with brown sugar until caramel-scented peaks formed and browned lightly in the oven. Families saved the first slice for honored guests or elders, a sign of respect and affection. The pie carried the sweetness of the southern soil and the skill of generations who knew how to stretch simple ingredients into celebration. Children licked the mixing bowls clean while parents watched the meringue rise, a shared moment of anticipation before the feast. Over time, commercial pies and instant mixes dulled the tradition, but those who remember the warm aroma of brown sugar meringue know that this dessert is more than food. It is a memory of family love, patient hands, and the quiet pride of homemade beauty. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Liver and onions with pan gravy paired the deep, earthy flavor of seared beef liver with the gentle sweetness of caramelized onions for a meal that was hearty and nourishing. It was once a staple in many African American homes, especially in rural communities, valued for its affordability and high iron content. After the liver was browned, the pan drippings were turned into a rich brown gravy, thickened with flour and seasoned with salt and pepper. Served with mashed potatoes or rice, it offered comfort and satisfaction. While the strong flavor of liver wasn't for everyone, those who grew up with it often carried the taste into adulthood. In the days before easy access to costly cuts of meat, liver provided an accessible protein source that fit a waste-not approach to cooking, ensuring no part of the animal went unused, and every meal was as filling as it was purposeful. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Fried catfish was both sustenance and celebration, pulled from rivers and streams by those who depended on fishing for affordable protein. Catfish were plentiful, easy to catch, and provided large fillets that could be seasoned and fried crisp in cornmeal. Families often came together around the preparation, with community fish fries turning simple suppers into neighborhood events. Fried catfish became more than food. It was tradition, bringing people together during hard years when joy was hard to find. Served with hush puppies or greens, it offered comfort while reflecting a strong sense of place. The crisp golden crust and tender flesh became a favorite for children and adults alike. In the 1950s, when money was short, the ability to catch your dinner from a river meant freedom and survival. Fried catfish told a story of resourcefulness, community, and pride in making the most of what nature provided, even when times were unforgiving. Cane syrup biscuits were one of the sweetest ways families could begin a day when sugar was a luxury. Freshly baked biscuits were split open and drizzled with thick cane syrup, a cheaper sweetener that was widely available in the South. This breakfast offered comfort and energy, especially for children heading to school or adults preparing for long days of labor. Cane syrup added richness to otherwise plain bread, transforming simple biscuits into a treat. It was a dish tied directly to the land, since cane syrup came from local harvests and represented self-reliance. Families treasured it because it gave sweetness without breaking the budget, a rare indulgence during lean times. Cane syrup biscuits became more than breakfast. They were symbols of hope, resourcefulness, and the sweetness people clung to even in struggle. The dish carried both nourishment and spirit, helping fuel resilience during mornings that demanded strength. For many, it was the taste of home and perseverance. Hoghead cheese was a triumph of resourcefulness, transforming every part of the animal into a dish of surprising elegance. After a hog was butchered, the head was simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and spices until the meat fell from the bone. The rich broth was strained and cooled, setting into a savory jelly that held tender shreds of meat and subtle seasoning. Sliced and served cold with crackers or bread, it became a delicacy at gatherings where nothing was wasted and flavor was celebrated. Making it required patience and skill, with families sharing techniques that varied from one household to the next. Children watched the slow process with a mix of curiosity and awe, learning that thrift could create unexpected pleasures. Today, few people undertake the labor of hoghead cheese, and store-bought versions lack the character of the homemade original, but its history endures as a testament to resilience and the deep respect African-American cooks held for every gift the animal provided. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort. Food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Hoe cakes were more than just cornmeal pancakes. They were a connection to labor, history, and home. Made from a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were cooked on flat iron griddles, skillets, or even the flat side of a hoe blade over an open fire. This made them quick to prepare in the fields or at home, perfect for feeding hungry workers. Hoe cakes had a crisp edge, soft center, and a flavor that paired well with everything from syrup to savory stews. In African American history, they represented sustenance during long days and ingenuity in cooking methods. They could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what was available to serve alongside them. While modern kitchens have replaced open fires, the memory of hoe cakes remains tied to family stories and community meals. Their simplicity made them timeless, yet their presence on tables today is far less common than it once was. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrappin' soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Cornbread skillet bread was the backbone of countless meals, baked right in heavy cast iron pans that turned simple batter into golden, hearty wedges. Made from cornmeal, water, salt, and whatever fat was on hand, it could be cooked quickly and fed an entire family. When wheat flour was too expensive, cornbread became the daily bread that anchored suppers and breakfasts alike. Its dense texture soaked up potlikker from greens, carried gravies, and stretched stews into something more filling. Families treasured it because it required almost no special ingredients, just the basics from fields and pantries. Sweetened versions were rare in poor households, where every grain of sugar was saved, so the bread was most often savory and practical. Served hot from the skillet, it provided warmth and comfort on cold nights, eaten plain or with a dab of molasses if someone was lucky. Cornbread skillet bread was not just a side, it was survival itself, versatile, cheap, and woven into the rhythm of life. Homemade apple butter toast was a breakfast that stretched the fruits of summer into the long months of winter. Families would cook apples down with spices until they formed a thick, sweet spread, preserving it in jars for the cold seasons. Spread over stale bread, biscuits, or cornbread, apple butter transformed plain staples into something comforting. It was a way of saving harvests, ensuring that fruit could be enjoyed long after the orchards were bare. Apple butter toast was often served to children before school, giving them a sense of sweetness and strength in the mornings. Adults valued it for its practicality, as a single jar could last weeks and provide flavor to otherwise bland meals. It was not just a spread, but a memory of orchards, harvest work, and the determination to make food last. Apple butter toast became a symbol of both survival and warmth, offering families a taste of sweetness during hard times. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Ash-cooked sweet potatoes were a simple yet unforgettable treat. Whole sweet potatoes were nestled directly into the hot ashes of a wood-burning fireplace or outdoor fire pit, slowly roasting until their skins blackened and their insides caramelized. The result was a soft, smoky sweetness that needed no sugar or butter to shine. In African American households, especially in rural areas without modern ovens, this method was both practical and flavorful. The smell of roasting sweet potatoes would fill the air, drawing children and adults alike to the hearth. Once cooked, they could be split open and eaten right from the skin, often as a snack on cold evenings. This was food tied to patience and tradition, a reminder that sometimes the simplest preparations yield the richest flavors. Today, with most cooking moved indoors and convenience foods replacing old methods, ash-cooked sweet potatoes are rarely made, but for those who tasted them, they remain unmatched. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Red beans and rice stood tall as one of the most efficient meals of the 1950s, capable of feeding large families for days with minimal cost. The beans offered protein, the rice added bulk, and together they created a complete, filling dish that sustained both body and spirit. Cooked slowly on the stove, beans became creamy and flavorful, often seasoned with onions, garlic, or a scrap of ham bone if it was available. It was the kind of recipe that rewarded patience, turning the cheapest staples into something deeply satisfying. Mothers made huge pots that could stretch through several meals, reheated each day with flavors that only grew richer. For many, it was a taste of home and community, often served during gatherings where neighbors shared what little they had. Beyond nourishment, it was practical, because rice and beans were cheap, stored well, and required no complicated cooking. Red beans and rice became more than food. It was proof that with little, families could still find abundance and flavor. hog jowl and eggs was a breakfast that appeared especially around holidays, but its flavor and memory carried into everyday life. Hog jowl, a fatty cut of pork, was cheap and easy to find, especially in rural southern communities. Sliced thin and fried in skillets, it released rich fat that flavored the eggs cooked alongside it. Families treasured this dish when it appeared, because it added luxury to otherwise plain meals. It symbolized celebration, but it also reflected practicality, since hog jowl was inexpensive compared to other pork cuts. During the Civil Rights era, it fueled mornings with sustenance and comfort, giving families strength for long days ahead. Hog jowl and eggs represented both tradition and resilience, showing how households could enjoy moments of abundance even when times were lean. The dish was not only food, but a reminder of family gatherings, warmth, and the power of making the most of overlooked cuts. Molasses, stacked cake graced weddings and homecomings with a sweetness born of patience and skill. Thin layers of spiced cake were baked individually, then stacked high with a rich molasses filling that soaked into the crumb as the dessert rested overnight. The dark syrup lent a deep flavor that spoke of both Caribbean cane fields and southern kitchens. Families often baked the layers days ahead, turning the assembly into a festive gathering where aunts and cousins worked side by side. Each slice told a story of celebration and endurance, for molasses was affordable and plentiful even when other sweeteners were scarce. The cake's tall, impressive stature made it a centerpiece on tables decorated for special occasions, a symbol of abundance even in lean times. Today, few households take the time to roll, bake, and stack so many delicate layers, and the recipe lives mostly in old family cookbooks. Those who have tasted it know the quiet triumph of a dessert that rewards effort with lasting memory. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Souse meat was a cold, tangy delicacy that turned humble pork trimmings into something worth savoring. Often made from a pig's head, trotters, or other cuts rich in collagen, the meat was boiled until tender, pulled from the bone, and then packed into a loaf pan with a briny vinegar and spice mixture. As it cooled, the gelatin-rich broth set into a firm, sliceable terrine that was served chilled. For many African-American families in the rural South, this dish was a symbol of thrift and skill, taking what was available and making it delicious. It was often eaten with crackers, bread, or straight from the plate with mustard. The tang of the vinegar, the seasoning, and the rich texture made it stand out, especially during hot weather when lighter meals were preferred. Though it takes time and patience to prepare, souse meat was once a regular sight at kitchen tables and church socials alike. Today, it has nearly vanished from common diets, remembered fondly by those who know the balance of tart, savory, and satisfying in every slice. Collard greens with salt pork were a survival dish that filled pots across Black households in the 1950s, stretching meager ingredients into meals that lasted for days. Salt pork scraps, often overlooked by wealthier buyers, flavored the greens with smoky richness while providing just enough fat to make them satisfying. The collards themselves were homegrown or picked up cheaply from markets, making the dish accessible even when money was scarce. Mothers and grandmothers simmered the pot for hours, letting the greens soften and soak in every bit of flavor. The broth, called potlikker, was prized for its nutrients and sopped up with cornbread, so nothing was wasted. For many families, this dish was not just food, but medicine, a way of keeping strength up through lean times. It carried cultural pride as much as it carried nourishment, representing both resilience and resourcefulness. Today, collard greens remain a staple, but few remember that in the 1950s, they were lifelines, simmered with love and scraps to keep families strong through hardship. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Cowtail stew was a dish that proved how patience could transform the least expensive cuts into nourishing, satisfying meals. Cowtails, later known as oxtails, were once considered scraps, sold cheaply to families who needed affordable protein. When simmered low and slow, the meat softened and released a deep, gelatinous richness that turned broths into silky gravies. Families would add onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever vegetables they had, stretching the dish further to feed as many mouths as possible. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a hearty and complete meal. The long cooking time was worth it because the result was tender meat clinging to bones and broth that carried warmth on cold nights. Cowtail stew became a classic in many households, not because it was glamorous, but because it was practical and nourishing. It reflected resilience and the ability to draw strength from what others overlooked, turning scraps into comfort. It was survival, love, and resourcefulness simmered together in a pot. Giblet gravy over rice was one of those dinners that showed how nothing went to waste in the kitchen. Chicken was expensive, but the innards, the gizzard, liver, and heart, were cheap or sometimes even given away by butchers. My grandmother chopped them small, simmered them in broth, and thickened the pot into a rich gravy that smelled like Sunday supper. Poured over rice, it became hearty enough to stretch across the whole family. The rice soaked up the flavor, turning a small handful of giblets into a meal that fed 6 mouths without complaint. Some children turned up their noses at first, but hunger taught quick appreciation, and the taste of the gravy was strong, savory, and full of life. She said, "Giblet gravy was proof that dignity came not from the cut of meat, but from the hands that prepared it." In the 1960s, this dish carried people through lean nights, filling bowls with warmth when little else could be afforded. Giblet gravy over rice was frugality turned into something satisfying. Molasses stack cake was the kind of dessert that carried a sense of occasion. Multiple thin layers of cake, sweetened with rich molasses, were stacked high with spiced apple filling or sorghum syrup spread between them. The layers were assembled in advance, allowing the flavors to meld and the texture to soften into a tender, almost pie-like bite. For African American families in the South, this cake was a way to celebrate with what was on hand, often using sorghum molasses from local mills. It appeared at church suppers, weddings, and holiday feasts, each layer baked carefully and sometimes contributed by different family members. The taste was deep, warm, and slightly tangy, making it distinct from sugar-based cakes. Over time, as refined sugar became more accessible and baking trends shifted, the molasses stack cake faded from everyday kitchens. Yet for those who remember it, the sight of a tall, dark spiced cake still brings back the feeling of a special day when everyone gathered to share. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Homemade sorghum syrup cake was a sweet treat born out of necessity, making use of local sorghum syrup when sugar was too costly. The cake batter was simple, relying on flour, eggs, and syrup for both sweetness and moisture. Baked in family kitchens, it filled homes with a rich, comforting aroma that lifted spirits even when pantries were bare. Sorghum was cheaper and more accessible than refined sugar, making it the go-to sweetener in many rural communities. The cake was often saved for Sunday dinners or special occasions, giving families something to look forward to. Children treasured every slice, savoring the sticky sweetness that felt rare in lean years. Adults valued how the recipe stretched simple ingredients into something celebratory. Homemade sorghum syrup cake was proof that even in hardship, joy could still be found at the table. It was a dessert that carried culture, thrift, and love in every bite, disappearing almost as quickly as it was served. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp, golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small, crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. While it may not be common today, boiled hog maw represented survival cooking at its most inventive. It turned what others discarded into sustenance, showing that resilience could be found in every pot, no matter the ingredient. Pickled watermelon rinds were the very definition of waste, not want not, turning scraps into something bright and flavorful at a time when nothing could be thrown away. Families peeled the white rinds, boiled them with vinegar, sugar, and spices, then stored them in jars to last for weeks. The result was a tangy, crunchy pickle that accompanied heavy meals, cutting through the richness of beans, pork, or stews. It gave people the satisfaction of having something that felt almost fancy, even though it was made from what would otherwise have been tossed aside. Children sometimes loved the sweet-sour flavor, while others found it odd, but nearly everyone appreciated the practicality. Pickled watermelon rinds also carried cultural roots, with recipes passed down across generations in Southern households. They became a reminder that creativity and thrift could bring new life to even the humblest scraps. Long before sustainability was a trend, this dish made sure no part of the harvest was wasted, providing both flavor and memory in every crunchy bite. Buttermilk cornbread baked in cast iron anchored countless suppers with its golden crust and tangy bite. The heavy skillet, seasoned from years of use, gave the bread a flavor impossible to match in a modern pan. Families stirred cornmeal with fresh buttermilk, a little lard, and a pinch of salt, then listened for the satisfying hiss as the batter hit hot iron. The result was a loaf both crisp at the edges and tender inside, perfect for soaking up potlikker from simmered greens or for eating plain with a drizzle of cane syrup. Grandmothers often taught their grandchildren to test the heat of the skillet by flicking in a few drops of water, a small ritual that connected generations. On Sundays after church, the scent of baking cornbread drifted through neighborhoods, promising a meal that united family and friends. Today, prepackaged mixes and quick breads have replaced the slow, careful method that once defined African American kitchens, and the art of true cast-iron cornbread grows rarer with each passing year. Sweet potato coffee cakes were born of Southern improvisation, where fresh sweet potatoes were mashed into dough to stretch ingredients and add natural sweetness. Families mixed the potatoes with flour, sugar, and spices, creating a dense but moist cake that could be sliced and shared in the mornings. It carried the familiar flavor of sweet potatoes while saving on costly ingredients like butter or eggs. For children, sweet potato coffee cakes often felt like a treat, while adults appreciated the practicality of turning a root vegetable into a breakfast staple. The cake was filling and long-lasting, offering energy for long days of labor or activism. Because sweet potatoes were plentiful and inexpensive, this dish became a common sight on tables throughout the Civil Rights era. It was a symbol of making do, a reminder that families could create joy from what the land provided. Sweet potato coffee cakes carried resilience in every bite, bringing comfort to households even in the hardest years. Field pea cakes were one of those breakfast recipes that reflected both creativity and frugality. Leftover field peas would be mashed and mixed with cornmeal, onion, and a touch of seasoning, then shaped into patties and fried until crisp. They were simple to prepare and stretched whatever little was left from dinner into the morning meal. For farming families, peas were easy to grow and store, making them a dependable staple. The patties were hearty enough to satisfy hunger and could be eaten plain or alongside bread, syrup, or even a bit of bacon when available. The texture was soft inside with a crunchy crust that made them appealing to both children and adults. Field pea cakes spoke to the ingenuity of cooks who made sure nothing went to waste. They were not just thrifty, but also delicious, proving that even the simplest ingredients could be turned into a breakfast worth remembering. Smothered pork chops turned inexpensive, tough cuts into tender, flavorful meals that fed families when money was tight. The chops were seared, then simmered in rich onion or mushroom gravy until they softened and soaked up every bit of flavor. Served with rice or mashed potatoes, they stretched far beyond the small portions of meat that went into the pan. This dish showed how skill and patience could transform affordable cuts into something that felt hearty and comforting. Smothered pork chops became a Sunday dinner favorite in many households, offering the illusion of luxury even when ingredients were modest. Families appreciated that it was both filling and delicious, making it a repeat on weekly menus. For children, the dish carried nostalgia as a special treat, while adults valued its practicality and affordability. Smothered pork chops were the definition of survival cooking, reminding families that with time, creativity, and a good gravy, even tough times could taste tender. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Homemade syrup sandwiches were one of the quickest breakfasts for children heading to school or adults heading to work. A slice of bread was spread with cane syrup or sorghum, then topped with another slice and eaten on the go. It was sticky, sweet, and satisfying, even if it was far from fancy. Families leaned on it because it was cheap, easy, and gave just enough energy to last until the next meal. For children, it often felt like a treat, even when it was born out of necessity. Adults remembered it as a sign of thrift, proof that households made do with what they had. Homemade syrup sandwiches were a dish of survival and memory, tied to the realities of life in communities that faced both economic and social hardship. They symbolized not only sweetness in lean times, but also the determination to keep moving forward each morning, fueled by the simplest of meals. Sweet potato biscuits once brought warmth to breakfast tables and Sunday dinners alike. Mashed sweet potatoes blended with flour, butter, and a touch of sugar created a dough that baked into soft, slightly sweet rounds. These biscuits paired beautifully with salty country ham or a drizzle of sorghum syrup, offering a perfect balance of savory and sweet. Families often baked them in batches large enough to feed relatives and neighbors, turning an ordinary morning into a quiet feast. The natural sweetness of the potatoes gave the biscuits a gentle orange hue, a visual comfort as well as a culinary one. Children were often given the task of mashing the cooked potatoes, a small role that made them proud participants in a beloved family recipe. Today, store-bought rolls and instant mixes have replaced the slow, careful preparation of true sweet potato biscuits. For those who remember their fragrance filling the kitchen, each bite carries memories of kinship, generosity, and a heritage that deserves to be cherished. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Batter-fried catfish was a highlight of Southern fish fries, where friends and family gathered for food, music, and conversation. Fresh-caught catfish from rivers or ponds were cleaned, filleted, and coated in a seasoned cornmeal batter before being dropped into hot oil. The result was a golden, crispy crust giving way to tender, mild-tasting fish. Often served with coleslaw, hush puppies, and tartar sauce, it was a meal that celebrated both the bounty of local waters and the joy of community. In African American culture, fish fries were more than a way to eat. They were social events that strengthened ties and offered a space for laughter and storytelling. Batter-fried catfish was a centerpiece of these gatherings, appreciated for its satisfying crunch and comforting flavor. While farm-raised catfish has made the fish more widely available, the traditional preparation and community-centered events around it have become less frequent. For For those who experienced them, the memory of hot, crispy catfish eaten outdoors among friends remains a cherished part of culinary history. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Rice and gravy suppers turned the simplest pantry item into a sustaining meal that carried families through countless lean nights. Rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook in large amounts, making it an essential staple in many homes. What gave it character was the gravy, often made from pan drippings, onions, flour, and water, transformed into something savory and rich. Even when meat was scarce, the flavor of gravy brought comfort, giving plain rice new life. This meal proved that survival cooking was not about excess, but about making the most of what was available. Families could stretch small scraps into flavorings that fed everyone at the table. It was warm, nourishing, and familiar, offering stability in a time when many other things were uncertain. Rice and gravy suppers may have been modest, but they filled stomachs and hearts alike, making them one of the most important dishes for survival and community during tough decades. Cold cornbread and milk was often called the poor man's cereal, but it was more than a label, it was a lifeline. Day-old cornbread, often too dry to eat on its own, was crumbled into bowls and covered with milk or buttermilk, creating a filling meal that could be eaten quickly before school or work. For children, it was breakfast. For adults, it was sometimes supper, proving its versatility. It carried a tangy, comforting flavor that became familiar in many Southern households. What made it special was not the taste alone, but the reminder that nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. In communities with little to spare, this dish represented survival and practicality. Cold cornbread and milk was part of the rhythm of daily life, a dish that carried generations through hard times and into mornings of determination. Even with its simplicity, it gave people what they needed to keep going during days that demanded courage and endurance. Do you remember the African American food traditions that faded over time? These dishes once anchored Sunday tables and family gatherings, holding generations of history. What do we lose when their flavors disappear from our kitchens? Hoppin' John on New Year's Day was once a dish of deep meaning, carrying the promise of good fortune into every household that served it. Black-eyed peas simmered with rice, onions, and smoky cured meat made for a meal that was both filling and symbolic. Families across the South would gather on the first day of the year, confident that a bowl of this humble combination could bring luck, health, and steady work in the months ahead. The peas represented coins, the rice suggested abundance, and the pork gave a sense of strength and perseverance. Elders passed down stories of how this recipe came from West African traditions that traveled through the Middle Passage and took root in Carolina kitchens. Children learned to stir the pot while listening to tales of ancestors who found comfort in its aroma after days of uncertainty. Today, many people know the name, but few carry on the ritual with the same devotion that once marked every New Year's morning across countless African American homes. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Hoppin' John was more than just a meal. It was a tradition steeped in hope and symbolism. Made from black-eyed peas simmered with onions, peppers, and pork, then served over rice, it was a dish prepared on New Year's Day to bring good luck for the year ahead. In African-American kitchens, especially in the South, the peas represented coins and the rice symbolized abundance, while the greens, often served alongside, stood for paper money. Smoked ham hock, bacon, or fatback lent a deep, savory flavor that turned simple ingredients into something rich and comforting. Families would gather around bowls of Hoppin' John, sharing not only food but the belief in a better year to come. Its origins trace back to West African culinary traditions brought over by enslaved people, blending with Southern ingredients to create a uniquely African-American staple. While it is still made in some homes today, the widespread observance of this tradition has waned, and many now know it only by name. Yet for those who keep it alive, Hoppin' John remains a flavorful reminder of heritage, resilience, and the power of food to carry meaning. Hog maw and potatoes was a breakfast that carried both weight and flavor for households that needed energy for the day ahead. Hog maw, or hog stomach, was cleaned carefully, seasoned, and slow-cooked until tender. Potatoes were added to the pot, soaking up the rich broth and spices as they simmered together. The result was a dish that was hearty, savory, and deeply satisfying, often eaten in large portions to provide strength before long hours in the fields or factories. Though not a delicacy, it was respected because it made use of parts of the hog that otherwise might have been discarded. The combination of meat and potatoes provided both protein and comfort, ensuring that families started their mornings with something filling. Hog maw and potatoes reflected resilience, turning less desirable cuts into meals that carried pride and tradition. Though it is rarely seen on tables today, it once served as a dependable morning staple. Okra and tomato stew carried deep Southern and African roots, becoming a staple dish when vegetables from the garden needed to be stretched into hearty suppers. Okra, with its thickening qualities, blended with tomatoes to create a silky, flavorful stew that was filling even without meat. Families would add onions, peppers, and sometimes corn, creating a dish that tasted like comfort in a bowl. The stew simmered slowly, and the longer it cooked, the more the flavors came together into something rich and satisfying. For many, it was tied to cultural heritage, reflecting traditions that reached back across generations. Okra and tomato stew was easy to make, affordable and nourishing, providing warmth and strength at a time when both were needed. It became a reminder of resilience, with each pot feeding more than just bodies but also preserving identity. At the dinner table, this stew brought people together, showing that food could carry both history and survival in every single bite. Fried bologna on white bread was one of the most common breakfasts for working families during the Civil Rights era. Bologna was affordable, and frying it in a skillet brought out flavor and made it feel more substantial. Layered on soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, it became a sandwich that was cheap, quick, and filling. For children, it was often packed as lunch, but for adults, it was breakfast before long shifts in fields, factories, or offices. The salty, savory taste was familiar and comforting, even if it came from one of the cheapest meats available. Fried bologna sandwiches symbolized both thrift and practicality, reflecting the reality of what many households relied on to get by. They were humble, but they carried enough strength to power people through demanding days. This dish became part of the memory of struggle and perseverance, a reminder that even inexpensive food could play a role in fueling determination and resilience. Homemade crackling bread filled kitchens with the savory perfume of pork fat and toasted cornmeal. Families saved every scrap of rendered pork skin, frying it until crisp and then folding the cracklings into cornbread batter rich with buttermilk and a touch of lard. Baked in a well-seasoned skillet, the bread emerged with a crisp crust and pockets of salty crunch that delighted children and elders alike. It was a dish born of necessity, ensuring nothing from the hog went to waste, but it also became a treat that people looked forward to at Sunday dinners. Neighbors often traded cracklings after a hog killing, turning the preparation into a social event that celebrated thrift and flavor. Today, store-bought cornbread mixes rarely capture the depth or texture of the old-style cracklin bread, and few families still render their own pork. For those who have tasted it, the memory of that smoky, savory slice remains a reminder of community resourcefulness and the joy of making something extraordinary from humble ingredients. Fried rice with scrambled egg was the kind of supper that could be made out of almost nothing but still managed to feel hearty. Leftover rice was saved from the night before, reheated in a skillet with a little oil or lard, and then combined with scrambled egg to add richness. My grandmother would sometimes add chopped onion or green pepper if the garden allowed, but the dish stood strong even without extras. The rice fried up golden, the egg binding it together into something more than scraps. A dash of salt and pepper finished it, though hot sauce often appeared at the table too. What amazed me was how it transformed simple grains into a filling plate that stretched across a family without breaking the budget. The meal carried warmth and thrift in equal measure, reminding everyone that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled egg was not fancy, but it was dependable, the kind of dish that fed children and adults alike with just enough to keep spirits steady. Hog maw stew was the kind of meal that made the most out of what was available, a true reflection of Southern frugality and resourcefulness. Pork stomach was cleaned thoroughly, stuffed or chopped, and then slow-cooked with potatoes, onions, and seasonings until the flavors melded into a rich, hearty broth. In rural African-American kitchens, nothing went to waste, and this dish turned what some might discard into a meal that could feed a large family. It was common to prepare this stew during colder months when hearty meals were most welcome, and the aroma would fill the house long before it was served. The texture was tender, the broth flavorful, and it was often accompanied by cornbread to soak up every drop. Beyond being just food, hog maw stew was a testament to survival, ingenuity, and the ability to transform humble ingredients into something memorable. Today, it is rare to see it on a menu, yet for those who grew up with it, the taste remains unforgettable, tied to family gatherings, laughter, and a sense of making do with what you had. Fried green tomatoes were a clever way to make use of unripe fruit that otherwise would have gone to waste. Sliced thick, dipped in cornmeal, and fried until crisp, they turned tart tomatoes into golden rounds of comfort. This dish became a Southern staple, particularly in households where gardens were vital for survival. It was both affordable and practical, making sure nothing from the harvest went unused. Served as a side dish or even as the centerpiece of a meal, fried green tomatoes carried both tang and crunch that satisfied young and old alike. The recipe was simple but effective, proving that ingenuity could transform even unready produce into something cherished. Families treasured the dish as a reminder that waste was not an option, and creativity was always in the kitchen. Fried green tomatoes were food that spoke of both necessity and joy, crisp reminders of resilience in every bite. Cracklin cornbread was a dish that brought a little joy and extra nourishment to the table, especially during times of struggle. Made by folding pork cracklings into traditional cornbread batter, it added both protein and crunch to a meal that was usually simple. Pork skins and fat were cheap and rarely wasted, and incorporating them into cornbread gave households a way to make breakfast more sustaining. Served hot from the skillet, cracklin cornbread was filling enough to carry families through demanding days. It became a staple for marches, farm work, or long hours in factories, offering both flavor and strength. Children remembered the satisfying crunch, while adults valued the resourcefulness that turned scraps into sustenance. Cracklin cornbread reflected a deeper story about resilience, showing how families took pride in making the most of what they had. More than just food, it symbolized unity at the table and fuel for the struggles ahead, keeping spirits alive through its warmth and heartiness. Red drink. Juneteenth punch flowed like a symbol of freedom and memory at community celebrations marking emancipation. Made from hibiscus petals or bright strawberries steeped into a deep crimson infusion, the drink stood for resilience and the blood of those who fought for liberation. Families would gather in churchyards and town squares, pouring the sweet, tangy liquid into simple cups while music and laughter filled the warm June air. Children chased each other between picnic tables as elders told the story of the first Juneteenth, reminding everyone of the hard-won joy behind the holiday. The punch often carried a gentle spice from cloves or ginger, offering a flavor both refreshing and layered, much like the history it honored. Preparing the drink was as important as drinking it, with women and men alike contributing fruit, sugar, and labor to the cause. Though some communities still keep the tradition alive, many younger generations have never tasted the vibrant red drink that once defined a day of remembrance and celebration. Which 1960s recipe did your mother turn into a feast? Drop your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these forgotten flavors back to life.